Welcome back to Hoochos. So we've explored NFT hydroponics, we've explored flood and drain hydroponics, we've explored ancient hydroponics, we've explored compact hydroponics, we've explored most hydroponics, but we haven't explored a full Dutch bucket hydroponic system. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get to it. All right, so let's do a rough parts list. I've got the two 3 meter planks, treated pine H4. I've got 6 of the cinder blocks. You're looking at 19mm flexi hose, 4mm flex tube, and 4mm barbed offtakes, as well as some white cloth tape. I'll also be using some panda film. 3 sets of 3 large paint strainer bags. Now, credit to MHCP Gardner for coming up with this idea for holding perlite. 19mm barbed elbow pieces. I've also got 19mm BSB male connector for connecting the 19mm tubing to the front of my Dutch buckets. Now, my Dutch buckets are going to be these Tawny Port food safe containers that I get for free from a mate who works in a bar. I've got 9 of them, or actually I've got more than 9 in total, but I plan on using about 8 or 9 of them anyway. My reservoir is pretty small. I mean, 80 liters, if you can count that as small, but I'll be using that float valve to run hose from my main reservoir to this reservoir so that when it gets below a certain level, it automatically tops up. Now, I'm also going to be using a length of 40mm return pipe with a cap on one end and a 90-degree elbow on the other, and some zip ties that I'll use to hold it up against the timber. I'm using a medium grain of perlite. Now, I was actually told to use a larger grain, but I think that the medium will be fine. They didn't have any of the larger grain in store. We'll tackle that problem as we come to it. But yeah, I've got 300 liters of perlite here, and that should be plenty enough. I got excess because I didn't want to have to go all the way down to the place that I buy it from. All right, let's start cutting the barrels so that we can make them into a usable shape with an open top. So for each of the containers, all I'm doing is drilling a hole in the plastic and jigsawing around the outside to take the top off so that I have an open bucket. So I'm just giving them a decent washout, and I'm just going to go around the edges with some sandpaper. And while we wait for those to dry, we're going to have a cup of tea. All right, so while they're drying, let's have a look at how we can connect buckets into a system like this. My buckets all come with a plug that was used to drain the bucket with a tap. Now, you can buy screw fittings for poly pipe that fit the size of the screw fittings on these jugs. So for me, the cheapest option to connect these buckets in series is to just buy a $5 pack, $1 each of these screw fittings. Now, depending on the bucket that you're going to use, obviously choose the cheapest bucket that you can get your hands on. So here I've got another bucket. This was used in my modular flood and drain hydroponic system. Now here I've used a bulkhead fitting to connect up 19mm tubing. Now, some people use elbows on the inside of their Dutch buckets. Now I think we can get away without using the elbow fittings due to the fact that we're using the paint strainer bags as a medium retainer. If this changes, all it's a matter of doing is pulling the paint strainer bag out with the plant and putting some form of shroud over the top of your exit pipe. My pipes exit at the ideal location, so about an inch up from the bottom. This seems to be what everyone has determined is appropriate, and these have the bonus of having a back leveled reservoir. So if you can see, there will always be that much water in the back, and there will always be this much water in the front. So if the pump does fail, you'll have that redundancy. I'm going to paint the bottom of my containers white. Panda film is just a plastic that is black on one side and white on the other, and it has light retardant properties. So I'm going to have the black facing in and the white facing out so that the white reflects the sun. That's a good cuppa. All right, now we can paint the bottoms. They're not really dry, are they? This one is. Here's a Hoochos hot tip. Pour yourself a beer while you watch paint dry. Because the only thing worse than watching paint dry with a beer is watching paint dry without a beer. Cheers. Oh, that's good. I think we should start a beer counter. Beer number 1. So this stuff is your Panda film, and it's completely light retardant, so no light can penetrate straight through it. You could probably just paint it, but if you have a look in here where I've painted, there's a little bit of light let through, but with the Panda film, none at all. So it's just the extra step that I'm taking to try and prevent that algal buildup. Hopefully I don't get any. Although on the bottom, I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, I'm just attaching it with cloth duct tape. This is a outside duct tape, so it hopefully will withstand the elements. Like so. Beer number 2, a passion fruit pale ale, for those wondering. I think that's actually better than the first. That means number 3 will be better than the second. All right, now we get to the fun part. I'm not saying that wasn't fun. I'm just saying there's a reason I've got a drink in my hand. So now we're going to put all of our BSB end barbs into the front of our grow buckets. Now, this is the point where if you're using other methods like uni seals, bulkhead fittings, or even just drilling holes, heating them up and pushing in a section of pipe, you'd be doing whatever your method is. So I'm going to go ahead, connect up my BSB to end barb, put an elbow on each of my poly fittings, have a section of pipe come down, and then we'll space the buckets and place our drain pipe along our planks running back to the reservoir. All right, so now I'm just going to cut sections of my 19mm poly piping so that it's twice the length of my barb and it gives a nice snug fit on my system's pipes like so. And then I'll cut lengths, but these lengths will be determined by how far your drain pipe has fallen from each container. So I'm just going to cut the lengths like this to start with, and then once I've set up my drain pipe coming down in front of the timber, we can then cut the lengths of each bucket's fall from the individual buckets. So once we've got our buckets spaced out how you'd like them on your bench, we're going to mark out and drill out our return pipe. Then you can just clean up your pipe with some sandpaper. It's like a mini NFT. Mini NFT. So to hang this, I thought of like a million different ways, but the cheapest, because the actual brackets are like $10 a pop. I'm just gonna zip tie around. I'll show you. So if I zip tie around the pipe like this, I'll leave it a little bit loose to start with. Then I can just drill a hole in the zip tie. Probably don't screw straight through it. I'll put a little hole in first, and then that will just hang the pipe like that. It doesn't need to be extremely strong. It's not supporting a ton of weight. And I can do multiple zip ties so it supports, with multiple zip ties. So let's see how this goes, just as a cheap solution to hang a pipe. All right, let's hang the pipe. Now all we do is cut sections of 19mm flex pipe that correlate to the drop in this pipe relative to the bucket. Just make sure that it doesn't go too far down and stop the flow from the previous bucket. All right, that's the return system pretty much done. Now we've got to do the feeder system. Now the feeder system, I'm actually going to have come up and under the buckets, where each of the buckets has this very convenient channel. So I'm going to run 19mm pipe along the length of it, and for each bucket I'm going to have 2 feeder lines coming from that 19mm tubing up between them and then into the top. So I'm now going to put an elbow on the end, which will run down into our reservoir and be fed by our pump, which I didn't mention you'd need, but obviously you're going to need a pump. So now we can go and fit our reservoir in. I'm going to bury mine somewhat because there's not enough height for the size of the reservoir that I've got. Then we can install our feeder lines, fill it up, see how she runs. Beer number 3. Okay, now I'm just going to make a hole in my res where I want my entry and exit pipe. Okay, now our buckets are all in place. We've got our poly tube going down the middle. Our res is sorted out and everything's pretty much where it's going to end up. So I'm now going to go along and poke holes in the 19mm poly tubing going underneath the buckets, and we'll install our 4mm end barbs. Now we can take a section of our 4mm flexi tube and make a piece long enough so that it'll reach into the bucket where you want it to feed the plant. So just make it a bit longer, and you can always just cut a bit more off. So in between each bucket, we'll have two, 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 and then on the end you'll have another single one. There we go. That's all the plumbing done. I actually forgot an end cap for the 19mm pipe, so I've just zip tied it over itself at the end. And yeah, don't forget the end cap. All right, now we can set up the pump and make sure the whole system flows correctly. Now, I'm not going to show you this in this episode, but I'm going to set up this float valve so that this reservoir will actually fill up from my main reservoir, which is over there. It's 1,000 litre IVC. So once this 80 litres starts to exhaust through transpiration, evaporation, and all the rest, this float valve will kick in and it will draw nutrient solution from my larger res. So I really only have to keep an eye on the larger res. And that'll allow me to just forget about my other hydroponic systems. Obviously, if that res is depleted in any nutrients, this one will then become depleted, so I'll have to keep an eye on that. But it kind of simplifies my whole maintenance process. So here's a quick system run through. The water is pumped up from the pump. It goes along the 19mm tubing, which runs under the buckets. It then runs up the 4mm tubing, where it's fed through the tubing, and wherever you place that tubing is where the feeder line will, flow to. So you place that onto your roots of your plants within the perlite medium, or whatever medium you've chosen. It then runs down through the medium. Then at the back here, there will be a pool of nutrient solution, which will act as a reservoir, just in case the pump fails. At the front, there will also be a reservoir just below this line here. The excess nutrients will run through here, out the front pipe, down the front pipe, and into the drain or return pipe. Now that return pipe comes down the system, enters back into the reservoir, and the system cycles like so. All right, now that the res is full, we can take the hose out and we'll do a system run. All right, so as you can see, the pump is now turned on. Our feeder lines are feeding into the buckets, like so. And once those back res containers are filled up, they'll start to feed into the front ones, and those front ones start feeding into this pipe, which will then run back like that. Okay, now that I've taken all the feed lines out of the buckets and the system's running well, so what we're going to do is we're just going to put the paint strainer bags straight over the top of each of the buckets. And now I'm going to go and fill them all up with perlite. All right, so that took about 150 litres of perlite for me. It's going to settle. I'm going to top it up. I'm actually going to let this system run overnight with just water in it, just to make sure that the whole thing's running properly. And it will probably wash some of the perlite out. and then I'll replace the res. So I will do a video very shortly about, the timing of feeding for this system and planting into and whatnot. But I'll do that in a Dutch bucket operations video. Cheers. Beer number 4. Or maybe it's beer number 5. Lost count. Anyway, that's how you build a Dutch bucket hydroponic system. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Hoochos. Consider becoming a Patreon. Like and subscribe for more. And I'll see you next time. Happy hydroponicking. Oh, you're going to grow so many tomatoes and peppers and just lots of plants. Mm. Oh, it was a good build.